All right, welcome to the panel on internet voting. I would say I would normally spend some time introducing the rest of the panel, but everybody here has been introduced multiple times already. I'm Matt Blaze, this is Susan, that's David. Ask anybody, we're all overrepresented on the program. This panel is just a discussion of the kind of theoretical foundation for why experts in in election systems and computer science are concerned about the inherent safety of internet voting systems. So we're calling it, is it safe yet? I don't want to bury the lead, no.
Done now?
Yeah, so thank you very much. Let me introduce our next talk. I want to talk a little bit about why. There's a common phrase that gets uttered all the time. I can bank online, why can't I vote online? Why can't I vote with my phone? We use computers to control aviation systems. Why can't we use computers to control, to cast our votes in elections? Why can't we do that? We use our phone for all sorts of private, very high security applications. Why can't we do voting, which seems like a much simpler problem with our phone? And I want to talk a little bit about the reasons that in spite of the fact that we are able to do all those other things successfully, we can't necessarily do that with voting, because voting is a much harder problem, and the problems that we have to solve in order to be able to safely do this are not merely software engineering problems, but actually fundamental theoretical problems that we understand cannot be solved with the current paradigms that we're dealing with. So the first problem in computer science, for those of you who have computer science degrees, we don't tell you this until the end of your degree, because we want you to not drop out first. There's a problem that we tell you about when you start taking theoretical computer science courses called the halting problem. The halting problem existed before we had actual computers, before computers were invented. It was posed in this form by Alan Turing, who invented the formalization of what a modern computer is, just prior to World War II. Halting problem is this. You take a general purpose computer, a programmable device, and you want to, what questions can this programmable device, if done perfectly, what questions can it answer and what questions can it not answer? And it's obvious some of the questions it can answer. Can it do arithmetic? Can it handle data? And so on. It can clearly do those things. So they're an example of a problem that computers can't solve. And this ends up being kind of like a logic puzzle. And the problem that was posed is called the halting problem. And it's very clever because it's a little bit meta. And it says, all right, let's say you take a computer program itself and use that as input. Can you examine a computer program using another computer program and answer the question, does this program have an endless loop? Will it ever halt or not? Now, if it will halt under some circumstances, it's pretty obvious it halts. If it hasn't halted yet, you don't know whether it's going to halt in the future or not. And with some sort of logical and mathematical and formalism trickery, you can actually demonstrate that it is a logical contradiction to use a computer program to examine another computer program in a way that allows you to answer this question. Now that sounds like a very boring question. But it turns out that if you can't answer that question, there are all sorts of other things you can't do. And one of them is compare a program with its own specification. In other words, you can't look at a program systematically and tell whether it is correct. And this is fundamentally a problem that we will never be able to solve because it is foundational, right? It's not, we can't program our way out of this by being smarter. Computers simply cannot do this. And never will be able to. And that's the thing we know. And that's when our undergraduates ask for their tuition back, right? Because we don't tell them this until late. But it means fundamentally that we cannot systematically build general purpose computer programs that that we know work. Now, these devices, our phones, are in fact quite complex, quite powerful general purpose computing systems. And any election software is potentially buggy. And that's a inherent problem with that. Now, if you have been to the voting village over the last couple of days, you've heard about how do we manage this? How do we conduct secure elections in spite of the fact that we don't have the ability to build software correctly and never will? Reliably, correctly, and never will. And you've heard things like the concept of software independence, right, which Ron Rivest, the inventor of software independence, told us about yesterday. The concept that the outcome of the election should be independent of software. And then we heard a way of implementing software independence through something called risk limiting audits, in which you have a reliable artifact of the voter's ballot, and you do a statistically rigorous comparison of the machine interpretation of the ballots with a human interpretation of these ballots that are reliable because they were marked by the voter. Well, unfortunately, the software on the phone might not be correct, and a phone is mediating the ballot itself. So in other words, there is no way to build a software independent, purely electronic voting system using general purpose technology on phones or other devices that people have. So this is fundamentally incompatible with what we understand the basic requirements for secure elections to be: software independence and the ability to conduct post-election risk-limiting audits on reliable artifacts of ballots. We can theoretically say this is not a thing we can do. Now, many vendors have produced what they claim are very good internet voting systems. And some of them are not very good, and some of them are much better than not very good. But none of them can ever meet this basic requirement for trust that the community now understands to be a baseline requirement for this. And this isn't a problem of engineering, it's a problem of theoretical foundations of what these devices fundamentally are. Now, there are some practical issues as well. These devices are exposed to all sorts of huge attack surfaces and so on. But even if we can solve those problems, we're still left with these fundamental issues. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Susan.
Okay. So I'm going to pick up there, and I'm going to say one of the fundamental issues is that the ballot is secret, and so there's no way to know that your ballot that's been recorded in this digital form in a non-software independent form is the way you wanted it recorded, or that's what was received at the election office. This is a fundamental problem different from the banking, and I'm going to draw a starker line under that. And so Matt's talking about the science looking into this. There have been so many studies. Now, I come from the advocacy world. I work for a nonprofit that advocates for more secure elections. So we have been, I feel like I'm echoing. I'm gonna move this down a little bit. So we advocate for more secure elections, so we advocate against any electronic ballot return. We work with other groups in this space, specifically Public Citizen, Common Cause, and Verified Voting. And the foundation for our advocacy is the research that's been done by the scientific community. There's been so much done. There was, David is probably going to talk a little bit about his research going back to 2004, that there was a report that was done by the Department of Defense that said until the fundamental architecture of the internet changes, we're not going to be able to do this securely. There's been a National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine report which said basically just don't do internet voting. There have been numerous studies from different states. Michael will talk about his research when he comes up here. There have been numerous research studies from different states. For example, in Utah did a study where they said it's so difficult to actually build a secure internet voting system. So in theory, you could build a stone bridge to Hawaii, but practically you couldn't really actually do it. They use that analogy. Berkeley, yesterday, I think it was Ron Rivest pointed to the University of California, Berkeley recently did a study that was funded by a guy who was really, really, really pushing for internet voting. And he wanted to find standards that he could employ to have a secure system. And after a couple years of looking at this problem, they came to the conclusion of everybody else that had gone before them and said, we don't know how to make standards to do this securely, so we can't write the standards. And incidentally, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, had said the exact same thing in 2012. So these problems are persistent, they have not been resolved, and we're in the same state. So given that, we know that there's so much abundance of scientific research that says you cannot do internet voting securely, you would think we're not doing any internet voting in this country, especially because we have concerns about the security of our elections, and we're told, don't worry, our machines are never connected to the internet. So we've lost our slide, I guess because we've been up here talking for so long. But we actually do have internet voting in the United States. There are 32 states that currently permit internet voting in different forms. Some permit it for email, fax, which fax today is all over the internet, or online portal. Everything that's up there that is purple, purplish, lavender, eggplant there's some form of internet voting permitted. Everything that's blue, there's no internet voting with the exception of Michigan currently does not allow internet voting. They have a law currently in place that's going to permit it in September of 2025. It has some technical requirements the law requires some technical provisions which have not been commercially available, and we'll see if they actually get a system that can meet the law in September, but right now they don't. And then there's a couple states, Missouri and Texas, that do allow electronic ballot return, for military and overseas voters, but for very limited circumstance if you're like in a hostile fire zone or you're getting combat pay. For the rest of the states, the people that are permitted to vote online are mostly military and overseas voters. There are some states where it's expanded even further to people with disabilities. Nevada is now allowing people with disabilities and anybody on tribal nations to vote over the internet. And so there's a continuing push to keep expanding internet voting. As an advocate and with our coalition partners, we regularly go to meet with state lawmakers and other elected officials and election officials and try to bring them all the studies and the arguments that people like Matt and the scientists have come up with and say, please, please, please don't push, don't pass these laws to permit internet voting. But what we are up against is that there is a very powerful lobby coming from the vendors of the systems that want to sell their product, as well as from different constituency groups. Sometimes it's the military and overseas groups that are pushing it because they want to enfranchise their voters, or disability rights groups. There's also a guy by the name of Bradley Tusk who I mentioned earlier that funded this study at Berkeley. He is very much of the idea that we can save democracy if everybody votes over the internet. He is a multimillionaire and he has put a lot of money into pushing this. And so just recently on a local news station, a news TV show, he was in my area of New York pushing internet voting. So these are the forces that are pushing for it, while their advocacy groups are trying to go out and say, no, don't do this. Now, there have also been some statements that have come out of the federal government in 2020 and again in 2024 providing a risk assessment from the Department of Homeland Security saying you cannot do this securely. And you would think that if that kind of definitive statements come out on top of all the scientific studies, it would be easy to prevent the expansion of internet voting. But what we find is that the vendors often try and push these systems with statements that are not true. So one of the ones that we hear all the time is, actually, this isn't internet voting. We're just going to store the ballot in an Amazon web cloud, and then they'll download it and get it at the elections office. So it's not, I'm not making this up, I swear to God. It's not internet voting, it's just going, it's a document storage feature in the cloud.
Motivated reasoning, I believe.
The other one we hear is it's not internet voting because it is going to be printed at the election office and you'll have a voter verified paper ballot. Now, if you've been around the voting village, you know how important a voter verified paper ballot is to providing that record of voter intent. But I don't know how somebody who is voting from overseas and sends their ballot in over the internet and it gets printed at the election office, that creates a voter verified paper ballot if they don't actually see that ballot. It's not voter verified. But that doesn't stop the vendors from saying this. I'm not going to go into too much of the details. I think Mike will have some more stories about his interactions with the vendors, but this is what we're up against. And it's often really hard to cut through this sort of rhetoric that we're hearing from the vendors. And there's a significant number of ballots that are being cast over the internet. In 2020, there were over 200,000 ballots were cast over the internet in the U.S. And in some states that have close margins, the number of ballots that were cast was significant. I think we would like to see an ability to roll back the internet voting statutes in these states. The only state that actually considered legislation to roll back internet voting was Washington State a couple years ago. Unfortunately, it did not pass. It did have some support from the previous Secretary of State. But unfortunately, if the secretaries of state or the election officials are not really too tech savvy, they don't understand the ins and outs of this, and they might kind of fall for some of the things that the vendors are saying. So unfortunately, that's the state of where we are right now with internet voting, it is what it is. So I will pass it over to David now for his remarks.
Well, thank you. I've been writing about and evaluating and testifying about internet voting for 26 years now. And generally, when I've spoken about it, I would detail a dozen or so threats to internet voting that all internet voting systems are heir to. Voter authentication attacks, client-side malware attacks, network attacks, denial of service attacks, privacy attacks, penetration attacks, vote buying attacks, coercion attacks, lack of voter verifiability, lack of auditability, insider attacks. But that's not what I'm going to do today. That would take 2-3 hours. Instead,
you have time.
Okay. You all have time, right? So instead, what I'm going to talk about is the beginning of the internet voting controversy and a pivotal moment or day in history where, if it had gone differently, we might actually have internet voting generally in the United States today. So in 1999, in the middle of the dot-com boom, those of you who are old enough to remember that, when the country was considering, when the internet was new but was finally widespread in the United States, so lots of people, maybe not the majority, but certainly vast numbers of people had internet access from their desktop machines at home. There were no smartphones yet. And people viewed the internet as an unalloyed boon to humanity. It simplifies life. It makes access to information free and universal to anyone in the world. And the question arose, well, why don't we vote online? Wouldn't that be exciting? And there were all kinds of stories in the press in 1999 saying, why don't we vote online? So in response to that, California Secretary of State Bill Jones, at the time, convened a task force on internet voting to study the issue. How should we deliver internet voting to the voters of California? And as fate would have it, I was appointed chairman of the technical committee of that conference, of that task force. Now, why did he appoint me? Not because I had any knowledge about security. In fact, nobody was thinking about security in contemplating internet voting. Security was not a big issue in those days yet. But he appointed me because he knew me as a computer scientist. I had built the website for the Secretary of State's office, I and my colleagues at Digital Equipment Corporation, and I had built the first website in the world delivering nonprofit voter information and live election returns on the web. So the Secretary of State knew me, and that's why I got the job. And I took it enthusiastically. I loved the idea of voting online from home in my pajamas at my leisure. What's not to love? Everybody loves that idea. It's very attractive. And I figured that our role, and I was the chairman, I figured our role was to not so much whether to have internet voting, but just how mechanically, logistically to deliver it to the people of California as soon as the 2000 election, which was a little more than a year away. But here's what happened. At some point in the middle of that task force, I had a chance discussion with my friend Kim Alexander, another member of the task force, but not a member of the technical committee, as it turns out. And she casually made a remark to me that has haunted me now for decades. She said to me, I hope that if someone's computer is infected with a virus, that won't mess up their voting. I said, don't worry about it. But that evening, I got home, and I couldn't let go of it. And I spent a sleepless night asking myself, what could a virus or other malware on a voter's computer do? And again, I didn't have any real security background, but I was a computer scientist and I could figure this out. And the answer was, it could do anything. It could change your vote. It could leak voter information, leak your vote to a third party. It could prevent you from voting, but think you had succeeded in voting. And it could do all of this undetectably, and it could erase itself. It was a nightmare, literally a nightmare. This was a profound fundamental flaw. And the very idea of internet voting was questionable at that point. All of the ameliorations to this I could think of, for example, allowing voters to verify after the fact that their vote was correctly received, they have their own problems. I couldn't figure out a way around them either. I knew that no programming methodology could fix this, no testing program could fix this, no cryptography couldn't fix this. This looked like a fundamentally unsolvable problem, the malware problem on the voter's computer. Now, 26 years later, that statement is as true today as it was in 1999. I knew this problem was not going to have a solution anywhere in the foreseeable future, if ever, for some of the reasons that Matt just described. It's a fundamentally unsolvable problem. So as the chair of this committee, it fell upon me to try to turn the committee around and say, hey guys, we can't recommend to the Secretary of State that he introduce internet voting. And I had to convince like 20 people that this was a bad idea, and I succeeded. I had to tell them that I explained that the positive opportunities offered by internet voting were far outweighed by the security concerns, the dangers. So we wrote a report that said something halfway. We said, all right, people could vote from the internet, via internet, from a precinct computer managed by election officials, but certainly not from a home computer. We had no control over malware. Now today we wouldn't even make that concession, but at the time that seemed like a possible way to go. To his great credit, Secretary of State Bill Jones took our advice. That doesn't always happen when you're dealing with politicians, but he did, and I was extremely grateful to him for doing so. He did not introduce internet voting in California, but it was close. Because had our technical committee gone the other way, had Kim Alexander not made that one remark which caused me a sleepless night, we might very well have set out a program for the Secretary of State which would have introduced internet voting to California in the year 2000, or maybe 2002. And if California did it, it likely would have spread across the entire United States, because California is, of course, the leading technology state in the union, and people look to California for that kind of leadership. So, if that had happened, of course, once internet voting is there, you can't get rid of it. Look at the fact, Susan just said, we haven't been able to get rid of email and fax voting, and we certainly wouldn't have been able to get rid of general citizen widespread internet voting had it been instituted. So, to Kim Alexander for that casual remark, I am very grateful, and I think the nation should be. It really changed things, and I've never told this story before, so if any of you know Kim Alexander, thank her.
So what we're going to do is we're going to take a few minutes for questions, but we're going to move to the next session, the war stories from Michael Spector, who will be, we're going to give him a little more time because he's got the really interesting stuff. So we'll take a few questions right now. Somebody could get the microphone up here. That would be great. Sorry.
So I completely understand the information theoretical, the computer science aspect of why it can never be secure. But I think what a lot of us have question for is, it doesn't have to be perfectly secure. Can we get it at least in the order of magnitude as secure as in-person voting, which is also insecure?
Mm-hmm. So you know, a good question as well. Let's take the framing. You know, I can bank online. Why can't I vote online? And look at that. You know, if we can make internet voting as secure as internet banking, we're completely screwed. Banking is incredibly insecure. Bank fraud is a daily occurrence. Financial fraud in general happens with enormous regularity. The reason it doesn't bother us is because we can reverse those transactions. We can, you know, if you're defrauded, it is mostly not a thing that you are liable for. Banks often quietly reverse fraudulent transactions without you even noticing that they've happened. And you are fundamentally made whole. The banking industry is able to exist because they can insure against this. None of those things are possible in the elections context. So, you know, if we look at other things we do over the internet and with smartphones, the security level that they achieve is nowhere near adequate for an election.
But in person is also not perfect.
It's not perfect, but there are ways in which, in fact, it can be made a retail problem, right? So it's possible to go and vote with a fraudulent identity, but you can't do that a million times yourself, right? The risk and exposure for traditional voting methods is a retail one. And wholesale fraud in electronic tabulators can be dealt with risk limiting audits and through software independence, which is a problem that you can't solve on a phone because it can't be made software independent. So essentially, all of the safeguards, retail versus wholesale fraud, risk limiting audits, and software independence that we can achieve with other voting methods just aren't available to us using smartphone or internet voting.
Somebody has the microphone.
Right on. Hello, hello. I got a follow-up to that question too. So I think that obviously there's some kind of allure for internet voting, right? And people want it because of its easy usage. And
By the way, everybody on the stage would be delighted if we could do
Of course,
it.
of course. I think we can all agree on that, right? And so to me, I think it's a fundamental issue of like having trust in the process too. And like, especially for people who don't have a technical background, being able to simply see the paper ballot in front of you takes no technical knowledge, right? You see the person's name on the ballot, you know that that's the person you voted for. But I think the other problem with it is
You
that,
don't know that,
well, let's barring all the other things that we were talking about.
barring what we're talking about.
Correct. But like, what I'm getting at is internet voting is inherently a risk reward, right? So for, let's say, overseas voters, because that's a primary example for why internet voting is attractive to states for that. Beforehand, right, before there was internet voting for overseas voters, they would send their ballot in the mail and ship it across this ocean and hope that it made it back to their precinct, right? Now, I've sent a postcard from Europe over, and sometimes it takes 3 weeks, sometimes it takes 3 months, right? And I think my question to you is, at what point is internet voting a better alternative for voters in that category than, and as a result could have more trust in it, than someone with a paper ballot, right?
So there's widespread, this issue has been dealt with in several ways. It's no longer true that it's as difficult to vote from overseas on paper as it used to be. For one thing, it's now required that overseas ballots be mailed 45 days in advance of the election. That wasn't true 10 years ago. Secondly, most states allow ballots to be counted if they are postmarked before the election day. They don't have to arrive by election day. So on both ends now, we have much wider margins for mail transmission. It's also true that from almost any major city in the world, you can mail back a ballot and get it to the United States in 4 or 5 days. It doesn't take weeks. Now, I suppose if you're in the bush in a small country, it may take longer, but you don't have good internet access there either. So the problem has been strongly ameliorated and widely exaggerated.
Yeah, let me also point out there, it's easy to find edge conditions for which internet voting is the only solution. What do we do about people on the space station, right? What do we do?
Submarine.
And
Their votes should still count, shouldn't they?
So we can, and okay, that's important, but the question is this at a scale in which it warrants it warrants exposing us to this level of risk for everybody else in the democracy. So the fact that sure there are people who will not be able to vote without internet voting. How big is that number? Those need to be part of the conversation before we start to look at risks and rewards. We have time for like one more question. Yeah.
A little bit more in this direction. A lot of organizations, such as board of directors or like members of an association, vote electronically because it costs too much to send out paper ballots and process them. Has there been any standardization for these cases that are not quite as severe in terms of consequence for doing internet voting? And is there is there a trade-off or two where we said, okay, if we sacrifice, say, privacy,
Right.
could we then have internet voting? Sure. You don't have a private ballot. You have.
If you're willing to have non-private ballots, things change radically in favor of internet voting. We also don't typically oppose internet voting if it's done by private organizations according to their own rules and their own purposes. We're talking primarily about public and quasi-public voting systems. By quasi-public, I mean things like labor union voting or
right.
other
Have
government-regulated voting processes.
Are those
union
standardized?
voting
Is
elections.
there any standards in those directions?
Standards?
I'm not aware of it.
No.
I haven't seen any. And what drives this largely are the private entities that are selling these products. And going to the question before about the certain circumstances where it's really difficult, I would think that we need to be looking at other things like proxy voting for people that can't access. When you vote over the internet, you typically have to waive your right to a secret ballot anyway because people on the other end are going to know who you are and how you voted. I would prefer to give my secret, to waive that right of my secret ballot to somebody I trust, someone that I've chosen, a close friend, a family member, somebody that I believe will pass on my vote correctly. But there's no big lobby for proxy voting, so that's why I don't think we're seeing that as a solution, unfortunately.
I should also point out the secret ballot is in the state laws of many states and is in the tradition of many other states. And I think we alter fundamental rights in order to accommodate a new technology very much at our peril, right? So with that, thank you very much. Next up is Michael Spector, who will talk about we talked about the theory. He is going to talk about the practice.